We've just explored how our senses and consciousness give us experience. But here's the million-dollar question. Is that all there is to knowledge? Or are there hidden gears in our mental machinery, other powers at play? To figure this out, let's put on our detective hats and examine the nature of the judgments we make based on experience. If we find some judgments that just don't follow the same rules, we might be onto something big. All right, let's look at what experience gives us. The defining feature of these judgments is contingency. Think about it. Contingency means they could be otherwise. Your mind isn't locked into them. You can actually picture the opposite being true. Take gravity. We all know things fall straight down, right? But can you imagine them falling sideways? Epicurus did. Or consider this, humans have senses. True, but can you imagine a human without senses? Maybe with superpowers instead. Absolutely. Every single judgment rooted in experience shares this quality. It's possible to flip it. Why? Because our minds, when forming these judgments, stay independent from the raw facts. We're not hardwired to accept them as absolute truths. Now, let's switch gears. Consider a different kind of statement. Every phenomenon has a cause. Try to imagine the opposite, a phenomenon that just pops into existence without any reason, no prior event leading up to it. Can you do it? Most people find it impossible. This kind of judgment isn't contingent, it's necessary. Its opposite is simply unthinkable. And this is a game changer. It tells us these necessary judgments have a completely different flavor compared to those born from experience. They must come from somewhere else within us. And indeed, there is another faculty responsible for this reason. It's the engine driving these non-negotiable truths. Sometimes people try to soften this idea and call these necessary truths universal rather than necessary. Like everyone agrees on them. But hold on, that doesn't quite cut it. Think about basic physics laws. Pretty universal agreement, right? Yet they're still derived from experience. So calling them universal is vague. We need a sharper term. Let's stick with necessary truths produced by reason. Another way to phrase it. These are judgments where the concepts involved are fused together, so tightly you can't pull them apart. But where does this impossibility of separation come from? Not from experience, because even if we always see A and B together, that wouldn't stop us imagining them apart. If it's not experience, then it must be inherent in the very structure of our minds. Our minds are built this way. So if necessary truths exist, it's because our minds are wired that way. There's an inherent antagonism, a fundamental clash, between certain ideas and the very form of our thinking mind. Just like other judgments arise from this same mental nature, these necessary ones are also its product. What do we call the rules governing a being? Laws. Therefore, necessary judgments are simply the laws of our own minds. We can boil it down to a neat definition. Reason is the collection of the laws of the mind. It's the rule book for our internal logic. This leads to something crucial. Since our minds have their own laws, and the external world also has its own laws, how can we know anything about the outside world? Only if the things we encounter align with our mental laws. When they do, that's what we call experience. These necessary truths, these laws of the mind, are given to us a priori. Now, be careful with the word innate. Don't think of it as little blueprints already stamped in our brains before we ever see anything. Nothing exists before experience starts. Instead, think of it like weight for a body. Weight isn't something added later. It's part of the body's nature. Similarly, necessary truths are an intrinsic property of the mind, part of its very essence from the get-go. Now, some philosophers like Plato had a different take. For them, these necessary truths weren't just about our minds. They were reflections of a deeper, perfect world of ideas, an intelligible sun illuminating our understanding. Reason in this view was impersonal, a mirror reflecting this higher reality. Without this external source, human reason would be dark. Thinkers like Victor Cousin and his student Bouyer echoed this, even writing books like Impersonal Reason. But we disagree fundamentally. For us, reason is deeply personal. It doesn't rely on some external deity or ideal realm. It's simply the unique expression of each individual's own mind. Kant, thankfully, landed on this side of the fence too. Okay, so we know reason comes from the mind's nature. But what exactly is this nature? What's the core essence of the mind that gives rise to reason? The text suggests it's a deep-seated need for unity and simplicity. Our minds crave order. We grasp simple things easily, like geometric shapes made of uniform space. But the real world is messy, complex, multiple. So our minds have this powerful drive to impose simplicity, to see patterns and unity even where things seem chaotic. It's like our minds are constantly trying to tidy up the universe. The job of the laws of the mind, then, is precisely to bring this order and coherence into our understanding of things. So, how does the mind actually do this tidying up? First, it sorts the raw material. Experience throws at us a jumble of stuff, external sensations and internal feelings. The mind immediately slots these into two main containers: space for the external stuff, time for the internal stream. This gives us our first two principles. All conscious states happen in time, and all sensory phenomena exist in space. But that's just sorting. The mind wants more structure. It looks at these phenomena and says, okay, they're changing, but maybe they're modifications of something underlying, something stable, substance. That's principle 3. All phenomena are modifications of substance. Then it asks about relationships. Why does this happen? It imposes causality. Every event has a preceding cause. That's principle 4. Finally, it seeks purpose. Do these events just happen randomly, or do they aim towards something? It introduces finality. Everything has an end or purpose. That's principle 5. These 5, time, space, substance, causality, finality, are the foundational principles Kant called constitutive because they actively construct our experience. Once we've built this structured world using those 5 principles, our knowledge isn't static. It needs to operate according to its own internal rules. Enter the 6th principle, which Kant called regulative. This is the principle of identity and contradiction. It states the obvious but fundamental rule: a thing is what it is. You can't have something being both itself and its opposite at the exact same time, from the same viewpoint. Think of it as the ultimate rule of consistency for our entire system of thought. It ensures that once we've built our mental world, we don't let contradictions tear it down. It governs how we reason about the knowledge we've already constructed. Now, Kant didn't invent these ideas out of thin air. Thinkers like Leibniz were already wrestling with similar concepts under his idea of sufficient reason. Leibniz even touched on identity. However, Leibniz didn't buy the a priori status for time and space. What Kant did was brilliant. He clearly distinguished between two types of principles. First, the constitutive ones like time, space, substance, causality, and finality. These are the active builders, shaping how we initially perceive and organize the world. Second, the regulative principle, identity or contradiction. This acts more like a referee, ensuring consistency within the knowledge we've already built. It's the difference between the tools you use to build a house and the rules you follow to make sure the house stands up properly. Okay, we've talked about the principles of reason, the laws of the mind, but what are the ingredients? Where do the ideas themselves come from? Look at a typical rational judgment. Phenomena of such and such a kind are subject to such and such a condition. Think about it. One part of this sentence refers to something we experience, the phenomenon. But the other part, the condition, the rule it must follow, where does that idea come from? It can't come from experience itself, because otherwise, how could it be a condition imposed on experience? It must come from outside experience. These are the a priori ideas, the first principles or rational ideas. Specifically, these are the ideas of time, space, substance, cause, and end. How did Kant think these ideas get into our heads? He had a neat system. He reserved the term forms specifically for time and space, calling them the a priori forms of sensibility. Think of them as the modes or filters through which raw sensory data must pass to become perceived experience. We notice that all our external perceptions fit into this spatial mold, and all our internal streams fit into this temporal mold. But what about the other ideas, substance, cause, end? Kant called these a priori concepts or categories of understanding. These are the conceptual tools our understanding uses to grasp and organize the phenomena already structured by time and space. But wait, some philosophers, like Herbert Spencer, pushed back. They said, hold on, time and space aren't innate. They're learned from experience. How? For time, Spencer argued, we just notice sequences. This thought comes before that thought. We feel the flow. For space, he proposed a clever experiment, touch points A, then B, then C. Then reverse direction, touching C, B, A again. Since you can recall the sensations of A and B even when you're at C, you realize they must have coexisted. From this coexistence, we get the idea of space. Sounds plausible? Not quite. There's a huge problem. To talk about before and after, don't you already need the concept of time? It's a circular argument, and for space, just because you can reverse the order of touching things doesn't mean they definitely coexisted. Think about hearing a melody. You hear notes one after another, but you wouldn't conclude they all existed simultaneously in the air. So the conclusion holds. The origins of time and space are indeed a priori. This line of reasoning also helps explain why geometry feels so solid and perfect. Some say we learn geometry by looking at triangles in the real world and just generalizing. But think about it. Generalization just means averaging out. There's nothing extra in the idea of humanity that isn't in any specific person. If geometric figures were just generalizations, they'd be flawed like real triangles. But geometric figures are perfect. Real circles aren't perfectly round. So generalization can't explain it. The real explanation is that our minds come equipped with an a priori idea of space, a point within it, and boundaries. Geometric figures aren't discovered, they're constructed by our minds using these pre-existing spatial concepts. We draw them, define them. That's why math feels so clear and precise. We're the architects of this mathematical world. What about the other big ideas? Substance, causality, and finality. Here the story gets a bit more nuanced. Reason provides us with the abstract principles, the idea of substance as something underlying, the idea of cause as a necessary predecessor, the idea of an end as a goal. But experience is needed to make these concrete. For substance, reason pushes us to think there's something behind the phenomena, but experience shows us what that something might be like. For causality, reason gives us the abstract notion of a cause, but it's our own experience of acting, seeing our will produce effects, that makes this idea vivid and understandable. Same for finality. Reason gives us the abstract idea of purpose, but observing intelligent beings setting goals makes this concept real for us. If we never saw intelligence, we'd either think things aimed themselves towards ends imminent finality, or conclude some external intelligence must be directing them. So, reason lays the blueprint, but experience builds the house and furnishes the rooms. Some philosophers, like Plato, thought there were even more fundamental ideas given by reason: the absolute, the infinite, the perfect. They argued we need these to understand anything else, relate finite to infinite, imperfect to perfect. But the text argues these aren't truly a priori in the same way. Why? Because they all boil down to the idea of the absolute, something complete, self-sufficient, needing no relation to anything else. Infinity is just the absolute in quantity, perfection in quality. But here's the kicker: the absolute is fundamentally alien to our minds. Our minds work by relating things, by imposing conditions. Knowledge requires at least two elements, a phenomenon and a condition. But the absolute, by definition, has no conditions, no relations. It's pure being, so we can never truly think about it without slipping back into relativity, relating it to time, space, or causality. As one philosopher put it, to think is to condition. All our knowledge is relative. Therefore, the human mind cannot grasp the absolute directly. This doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe it's the unknowable, the endless sea beyond our shores, as Littra called it. But it's beyond our cognitive reach. All right, let's pivot to the opposition, empiricism. This school of thought basically says, forget reason, everything comes from experience. Historically, this took different forms. The ancient sensualists like Democritus and Epicurus thought knowledge came from tiny images, eidola, flying from objects and imprinting on our souls. A bit clunky, right? Then came John Locke and the modern empiricists. Their famous metaphor is the tabula rasa, the blank slate. The mind starts empty, and experience writes all the knowledge onto it. Later, thinkers like Dugald Stewart and John Stuart Mill developed associationism. This is a stronger version of empiricism. It says the mind isn't just a passive slate. It actively works with experience, constantly linking ideas together based on association. Mill even called the law of association, the law of the association of ideas is to the mind what the law of gravitation is to bodies. It's a powerful psychological force. John Stuart Mill really went after the idea of necessity. He argued that what we call necessary connections aren't actually eternal truths. Think about it. What seemed absolutely necessary yesterday might seem laughable today. Pascal didn't believe in gravity initially, right? So, Mill says, maybe these connections are just local habits, provisional associations we've seen repeated so many times that we can't imagine them breaking. How does this work? He proposed it's all about association and habit. When we see A followed by B over and over, our minds develop a strong tendency to link them. If there are no exceptions, this link becomes incredibly strong, almost automatic. We then label this inseparable pair as cause and effect. So, saying every phenomenon has a cause is just shorthand for saying every phenomenon has an invariable antecedent, a pattern we've observed so much it feels unavoidable. But does Mill's theory hold water? The text raises some serious objections. First, Mill confuses the subjective with the inconceivable. Just because people used to believe silly things doesn't mean the principles we currently accept as necessary could ever become absurd. The hallmark of a rational principle is that its opposite is simply unthinkable. We haven't seen examples of truly inconceivable ideas becoming conceivable. Second, even if we grant that association creates a strong tendency, tendency isn't necessity. We always associate day with night, but we can easily imagine perpetual daylight or darkness. Mansell pointed out, we can imagine a stone floating on the 100th try, even if it always sinks before. We see heads on shoulders, but we can conceive of centaurs. Experience doesn't lock our thoughts. Third and most critically, Mill's argument relies on induction. He observes regularities in the past and assumes they'll continue into the future. But how do we justify that leap? We justify it using the very principle of causality he's trying to explain. It's a classic circularity. We assume the future will mirror the past because we assume causality is universal. But we can only assume causality is universal because we assume the future mirrors the past. It's a dead end. So empiricism fails, but then comes evolutionism, a newer twist. It says, okay, maybe reason isn't learned from individual experience, but it's still innate. How? Through heredity. The idea is that reason is the accumulated wisdom of our species, passed down genetically. Think of it like this. Just as birds instinctively know how to fly, because generations of birds figured it out and passed the knowledge on, humans are born with rational principles because our ancestor developed them and encoded them in our DNA. This is part of the broader evolutionary worldview championed by Spencer, applying Darwin's ideas to everything. The core idea is simple. Life adapts, advantageous traits get selected, and successful traits get fixed in the species through heredity. Reason in this view is just a highly evolved, hereditary instinct for survival and understanding. Does this evolutionary explanation for reason work? The text argues it doesn't. First, it's just a hypothesis. How would you test it? You'd need people who lack certain rational principles, but do such people exist? Even the most primitive cultures show reasoning, albeit childlike reasoning. They grasp causality, even if differently. This suggests the capacity for reason is universal, not just hereditary. Second, and more fundamentally, evolutionism doesn't solve the problem it inherits from all empiricism. It still needs a tabula rasa, but pushes it back to the origin of the species. But even if the species started with a blank slate, how could the first individuals ever acquire knowledge? They'd need the integrating faculty, the reason, to make sense of experience from the very beginning. But if reason is the result of experience, you can't have reason without experience. It's a classic vicious circle. Leibniz nailed it. Nothing is in the intellect which was not first in sensation, except the intellect itself. Knowledge comes from experience and from reason itself. Reason can't be derived from experience alone. Okay, we've established reason is a faculty of the mind. But here's the million-dollar question again. Are the principles of reason, like causality, just rules our minds make up for themselves, or do they reflect actual laws of the external world? Kant famously argued they were purely subjective. His idea was that our minds come equipped with these a priori forms and categories. When we encounter the chaotic, unordered sensory data of the world, we automatically filter it through these mental structures. We impose time, space, causality, etc. onto the raw material. This process constructs the world we experience, the phenomenal world. But in doing so, we inevitably distort reality. The real world, the things in themselves, remains unknowable to us. It's a noumenal world we can only conceive, not perceive. This led to his famous doctrine of transcendental idealism, the idea that reality is split, with our knowledge confined to the phenomenal realm. Kant tried to bolster his view by pointing to antinomies, contradictions that seem unavoidable when we reason about the world. For example, he claimed we could equally prove the world is finite and infinite. He argued these paradoxes showed we were mixing up two different realms, the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. Rejecting this split, he said, left us trapped in contradiction. But the text challenges this. First, these supposed antinomies aren't balanced. Often, one side of the contradiction is demonstrably false. Remember the example about complex substances being made of simple parts versus not. The text argues the former is true, the latter false. So no real contradiction there. Second, even if there were unresolved tensions, that doesn't automatically mean there's an unbridgeable gap between reality and our knowledge. Maybe there's harmony, not antinomy. The argument from antinomies, therefore, doesn't seem to hold up as proof for Kant's split reality. If Kant's argument fails, how do we decide if these principles are truly objective? We need a criterion, a standard to judge them. The text proposes using the principle of contradiction itself as this criterion. Why? Because it's not one of those constitutive principles that actively build our experience. It's more like a background rule of consistency. And here's the direct proof. Look at science. Scientists use the principle of identity and contradiction constantly in their calculations. They predict where a comet will be, and it shows up exactly where they calculated. The external world behaves according to principles that align with our logical rules. This demonstrates the principle has objective value. Using this as our benchmark, let's now investigate other concepts, starting with the idea of continuity, the notion of the infinitely small or infinitely large. Let's apply our criterion to the concept of continuity. The argument here is that the idea of infinite divisibility of the infinitely small or large is actually subjective. Why? First, look at time and space. Time is clearly discontinuous. It's made of distinct moments of consciousness, one after another. Space, too, seems likely discontinuous, perhaps composed of discrete points where fundamental forces act. Second, causality is discontinuous. An effect isn't a smooth continuation of a cause, there's a real break, a leap. Cause and effect form an ordered sequence. Yes, but it's an aesthetic order, not a mathematical one. The real world, it seems, is fundamentally finite and discrete. The purely subjective notion of infinite continuity doesn't capture this reality. It's a useful mental tool, perhaps, but not an objective feature of the world itself. And that brings us to the end of this exploration of reason's nature and its principles.